So as just stated, my name is David Wells. I work for Shadow Dragon along with Nico and many other people. While I was getting ready to give this presentation, I found myself at an interesting impasse. Reason for that being I'm not the sort of person that likes to talk about myself and talk about my background. Unfortunately, to give a little context for this presentation, I think that's almost necessary. So I'm going to do one of the things that I hate, give you a really broad overview of who I am and where I'm from. So for about 20-ish years now, I have been doing OSINT in one form or the other. I joined the Army as an all-source analyst in about 2004 and really got more official over the years. For about 10 years now, I have been training OSINT in one capacity or another. Multiple different tools, multiple different audiences. I've probably trained at least 24 different nations, just about every three-letter agency you can imagine, government, commercial entities. And what I kind of found out is you can really break down OSINT investigations into one of two categories. There's obviously a little gray area in this, but you've got your basic entity enumeration. The concept being you have a person, place, thing. This could be a building on the ground. This could be an individual you want to look into. Bottom line up front is you want to find as much about them as possible. Or you've got your monitoring workflow. Idea being is you've got a person you want to follow, or you've got a larger conversation that's happening, and you just want to be able to passively listen in on them. At any enumeration, generally a little bit easier. One of the reasons is you can get immediate feedback from what they're saying versus that monitoring workflow. It's a little more difficult. You rarely get that immediate feedback. You've got that data coming in and you're just sitting, listening to it passively, hoping those individuals or that community you're following says something you care about. Likewise, the workflows for that any enumeration process, they're generally repeatable. What you can do for one individual, the tools that you use, the way you dig into them, can be replicated across multiple individuals, generally on a one-to-one basis. Obviously, there's going to be some nuance in there, but you compare that to that monitoring workflow, and every community you're trying to follow is going to be a little bit different. They hang out on different places on the internet. They speak different languages. They have different slang terms. And the other bonus of that any enumeration is there's usually a final point, meaning you look at that individual and there's something specifically you want to find. You want to know where they're getting their Starbucks in the morning. You want to know where they live or where they work. That monitoring workflow is a little bit more difficult. There's usually not an established endpoint. Even if you do find some actionable information, you're still going to continue to monitor that conversation and that community. So again, over 10 years of doing this, I found monitoring is very, very difficult. And this is very tool agnostic. Again, I've taught tools like Babel Street, I've taught Flashpoint, I've taught our own tool, Horizon and Horizon Monitor. And people found this very difficult. I'm not talking about just beginners. I'm talking about people that would come into my class and say, I've been doing OSINT for 10, 20. I've been doing OSINT since before OSINT was actually a thing. But they get in front of that tool, or they just be doing this manually, and for whatever reason, monitoring would just go directly over their head. Well, there's many reasons for this. One of the main reasons is if you're not familiar with the specific community, even if they are speaking your native language, it can feel like they are talking in a foreign language. So I got a great example. I work with some very, very smart people. One of the smartest people I work with, he is very, very into the video game Doom. Not just playing it, like literally programming it, meaning he has contributed to some updates to the original like Doom for Windows computers. And when I talk to him about basic gameplay, obviously we can communicate back and forth. But when he starts talking about programming, I kind of look at him cross-eyed and I say, I have no idea what you're talking about. He could switch to Swahili and I would absorb just as much information as when he's talking about that very specific Doom programming information. Likewise, there are probably places on the internet that the communities you want to follow, you definitely don't know how to find them first off the bat. And even when you find them, the ways they communicate can be very difficult to understand. Anybody spend much time on Discord? That can get really weird, right? Like I'm an elder millennial at this point, and I hop on Discord and I say, I don't know what you people are talking about. Once again, they're speaking English, but it's not an English I understand. And this is a bigger one, and it goes back to what I was saying about that any enumeration. It can be very difficult right out the gate to know if your monitor is correct, because very rarely, once you set up that monitor, are you going to get immediate, good, valuable feedback. You're going to have to sit back and wait passively, maybe set up in some alerts, and cross your fingers that that monitoring workflow you've set up is going to get the data that you want. Noise. It is very, very noisy. You're talking about the entire of the internet, try and condense it and filter it down to something that you care about. We see these graphics about how much publicly available information is being produced, and you can pretty much make up some figure at this point, and it wouldn't be too different. There's 20 petabillion bytes of data being produced publicly every day. Yeah, that's just as probably as meaningful as the real figure. Bottom line is, when you're doing that monitoring workflow, you've got that massive amount of data to filter through. And this can be a nightmare to do manually. Once again, there's lots of tools that can help this process. But even if you have those tools, if you don't understand some of the very basics, you're going to have to deal with that noise. So, got some best practices. And again, I've applied this to multiple different tools. In almost every case, this saves so much work and so much headache. Probably one of the biggest issues I run into is when people start that monitoring workflow, they start with very, very broad terms. They say something like, well, there is a riot taking place in a location I care about, so I'm going to pull up the tool that I'm using to monitor. I'm going to type riot in the search bar. Well, think about that for a moment. What's going to happen if you are just searching for the word riot? Well, you might get people talking about the band Quiet Riot. Is that something you care about? Obviously not. You're going to talk about certain video games made by Riot Games. Do you care about that? No, you don't care about that. You're going to get Riot platforms. You're going to get people talking about Bitcoin mining. Probably don't care about that. This is all noise that you don't need. Get some Riot Punch in there. Now, this might be a pre-indicator of a riot taking place, but you don't really care if somebody is mixing Everclear with Kool-Aid and drinking it. And obviously, you've got every other riot that's taking place other than the one that you specifically care about. So just starting with those basic terms is, again, going to give you a massive, massive amount of noise. I've seen this in so many cases. Once again, people with 10, 20 years of experience, they'll sit in front of that tool and say, all right, it's time to monitor protests. Protests in the search bar. Or I'm monitoring for threats against the principal. I'm going to put in kill, murder, explosion, death, extortion. And then they get very confused about why there's nothing but a whole bunch of noise coming out the other end. Wrong button. So what works versus what doesn't? Number one, if it's not obvious, specific vocal accounts or thought leaders. Organizational groups or pages can be great with starting out. If you've got a community you're trying to follow, number one question you might want to ask yourself is, who's the community leader and where are those social media pages that you want to follow? Versus overly broad social media accounts. Going to common errors, I've seen people, they're like, all right, well, I'm trying to monitor stuff around the world, so I'm just going to plug New York Times and get every tweet the New York Times posts out. Well, out of everything the New York Times says, how much is actually going to be applicable to your monitoring workflow? Like 0.01%, if that. Unique hashtags. You're looking at a specific election, just the hashtag election, probably not going to be too relevant to you, because how many elections are taking place all over the world at any given time? Versus something like hashtag New York City Comptroller 2024. Now, if that's the election you're trying to follow, that's going to be much, much better. Versus incredibly broad hashtags. Again, hey, I'm searching for elections, so I'll put in hashtag election. You might eventually get to what you're looking for, but you're going to be dealing with so much noise, it's just not going to be worthwhile to you. Slang terms, jargon, unique dialect. This is going back to what I was saying about my computer programmer coworker who's into Doom. If I were to listen to him for like 5 or 10 minutes, I could probably pick out those specific terms that are unique to that community. So rather than doing a search for just Doom, I pick out those unique words that are relevant to just those people that are going to be involved in programming Doom. That's going to take me from listening to everybody talking about every iteration of a Doom video game to just those people with those that inside knowledge of programming it. Again, you want to avoid using those incredibly common words or phrases. Murder, death, kill, explosion. Those are just going to result out the other end with nothing but noise. And you're going to be staring at your output saying, I don't have 24 hours a day to do nothing but read through results. Localized keywords. Can you do area searches? Can you do GPS searches? Obviously, most social media nowadays is not being geocoded, but you can take that stuff that is and potentially build out communities on the ground from that single starting point, and then find those communities that you want to listen to. Versus very broad geographic terms. If you just care about a specific block in New York, why would you include the entirety of New York City when you're creating that monitor? Unless you just want a bunch of noise and you want to waste a whole bunch of your time digging through those results. Pushing the wrong button. Next thing you want to do, hopefully you've got some sort of way to filter your data. Most of the common monitoring tools that you're going to run into, be them commercial or off the shelf, are going to have some way to filter that data. And that's not an accident, because the people that are programming those tools realize that even if somebody does have very tailored, let's call them data feeds, you're still going to be able to want to filter out that data. If you don't have some sort of way to filter out your data, then that basic step number one is going to be all that more important. There's different ways you can set up those filters as well. It's not always going to be the same. We've got a lot of very technical people in here, and a lot of those cyber threat actors are going to have structured types of data. You're looking for things like IP addresses. You're looking for things like ASN numbers. You might be looking for email addresses. You can probably create a regular expression to filter out your data just for that information. Words or phrases that imply impending threats, posts that reference certain locations, you just want to filter it down. And again, this is one of the weird things that I run into is people will create that initial search and they'll say, well, why do I need a filter? I'm getting everything that I want from this specific account. I'm getting everything that I want from this specific hashtag. Well, what you're going to find out is even if you are tapped in to those communities, to those data sources, you're still not going to care about everything that's being said. So just a hypothetical scenario. Let's say that I'm working for Shadow Dragon. Bit of a stretch, I know, but I'm working for Shadow Dragon, and somehow magically we have tapped into every hacker community. We've tapped into every dark web forum. We have hacked into every niche location on the internet where they might be talking about our company, or they might be talking about cyber threats that they are working on. That would obviously be awesome, and that would be a great data feed, but is everything that they are saying going to be relevant to me? Probably not. I want to filter out that conversation no matter how good that initial data feed is. So great example, just a really simple Boolean search. I don't care about everything, but I want to know if they happen to be mentioning Shadow Dragon, or if they're mentioning Nico, or if they're mentioning our CEO, Daniel Clemens, or if they're mentioning our CTO, Elliot Anderson, or they're mentioning our tool, SocialNet, or Horizon, or Malnet. But again, I may not even care about every specific reference to Horizon. I might realize that Horizon can mean a lot of different things. So I can add a little more complexity to that as well. I want to know if they're mentioning Shadow Dragon and exploit, or Horizon and database, or Daniel Clemens and virus, or Nico Deckens and secrets. That filter is taking me from that massive amount, gigabytes, if not petabytes of data, to just hypothetically that actionable intelligence or that actionable information. So going back to step one, first thing you're doing is determining where that data that you want to find exists online. Everybody here is probably an OSINT specialist. Some of you guys might be beginners, but probably the number one thing that you know is there is a massive amount of data out there. No matter how you are getting to it, there's got to be some way that you can focus on it. Some specific corner of the internet that has the data that you want. And that first step is just figuring out where that data is. Likewise, figuring out who has that data or who is influencing that conversation. Step two, figuring out what you care about. You're in that corner of the internet that has that information. Now you're just filtering out for that relevant information. So finally, step three, profit, or at least have some sort of actionable information. Keep pushing the wrong button. All right, so you did step one and step two, you're done, right? You've created that awesome monitor and you've got nothing but awesome information. That's obviously not the case. Number one, the conversations that you're monitoring are going to constantly be changing. Communities evolve over time, either purposefully or accidentally. New inside jokes, new slang, new lingo pops up all the time. You need to adapt as the communities you're following try to adapt as well. You also want to continually get rid of that noise. Everybody here knows the Korean band BTS, right? No, yes? Yeah, very good. There is a period of time where I swore every single monitor that I would make would be polluted with references to BTS because they took over every marginally popular hashtag. So every time I created a monitor after a certain point, I would just put exclusionary terms in there. I don't want to listen to what people are saying about BTS. They might be an awesome band. I don't know. They are way outside of my age range to care about. Also, you're going to want to look for new terms to add. There's great ways to do this, going back to that concept of a foreign language. You're listening in on a community, you're looking at their posts, and as you're reading through, they're like, I don't understand that word. The moment you're looking at a unique community and you say, I don't understand that word, I don't understand that hashtag, or that phrase, I don't get the context of it, that should cue you into, hey, here's something that I probably want to add to my monitor. Because if it's unique to that community, it's going to allow me to follow them all that much better. You're going to want to continually refine those data feeds and filters. Probably one of the number one indicators that you want to adjust is you're not getting what you expect. And it seems kind of obvious, but if you've set up your feeds, you're filtering out that data, and everything that is coming back is irrelevant to you, you're getting nothing but a bunch of noise, it's probably not a fault of the tool that you're using. It's probably just a fault of the feeds that you put in there. Is that hashtag you're using actually being used by some other organization? And is there a way to filter it out? All right. So I'm going to run through a really quick example of this right now. So back in 2024, there was actually a series of protests that were taking place in Kenya. What it boiled down to is people had decided that there were certain decisions by the Kenyan government that were causing massive debt, possibly increasing food prices, and I'd kind of decided that I wanted to listen in on this. Yeah, and it's a good thing we can't relate to rising food prices and increasing debt rates, right? Yeah, completely foreign to us. So I could have done this one of two ways. I could have done this the way a lot of people would approach it. Just go into the tool that I'm using and say, all right, I'm monitoring protests, I'll type in protest. I'm monitoring Kenya, I'll type in Kenya. I'm monitoring food insecurity, so I'll type in food insecurity. Now, would there hypothetically have been some data coming out the other end that would have been relevant to me? 100%. Would I have had the time to read through all of the noise that was irrelevant? Not unless I dedicated 24 hours a day to just reading through nothing but the results that came out the other end. So I went the other way. I took a basic step back and said, all right, well, let's at least find some very, very basic information. And this step right here is where most people get hung up. We're all motivated to do our job and we want to start getting data back as soon as we possibly can. And because of that, a lot of us are very hesitant to do that initial research to set up that monitor correctly. Again, you just want to start typing in terms into your search box, into your databasing tool, and getting results back. That will work. However, that initial steps you can take is going to save you a lot of time in the long run. So I just went out and did nothing but look for some news stories online. I looked for those news stories and was able to find those specific organizations that were organizing the protests. I found a handful of unique hashtags where people were talking about where to go, talking about where to organize, and airing those grievances. Now, these screenshots are from Shadow Dragon's own tool, creatively called Monitor for monitoring. But you can see right there, again, I got those unique organizations, was able to find their social media accounts, went ahead and plugged them in there. Found people talking about those, so used those organizations as a specific keyword to look for Twitter posts or Facebook groups. Anything that was focused on that specific community, because once again, I didn't care about protests all over the world. I didn't care about everything that was happening in this corner of the world. I cared just about those protests related to increasing food prices and increasing debt. And by taking those initial steps, I can make sure that I can focus just on those communities and not get a whole lot of noise. And this was really great because the moment this data started coming in, I could immediately look at it and say, hey, everything that is coming back is relevant to what I'm looking for. I'm not getting a whole lot of noise. A little bit of it snuck in here and there, but for the most part, because I took those initial steps to stand back and find local groups, local hashtags, my end results were much better. Now, I probably could have improved on this right off the bat. Probably actually could have done foreign language searches, since not everyone in Kenya is going to speak English. But for right out the gate, again, just taking 10 or 15 minutes, my results went from 99.99% noise to 99.99% valuable information. And this isn't a workflow that's just relevant just for monitoring protests. Once again, I've been doing this for a while, and any OSINT investigation that I've seen, taking that initial time to research your communities, research those conversations, is going to save you time out the gate. I wasn't done yet, though. I'm getting that valuable information, but do I necessarily care about everything that's happening in that conversation? No, I want to see where people are actually organizing those protests. That way, hypothetically, if I were in charge of allocating resources, I could allocate security resources to where those protests are being organized. Or if there is an actual impending threat against a government official, I could actually provide some security to them. Just for the reference, this is all hypothetical. I wasn't actually doing that. But if I was monitoring for that purpose, being able to filter those conversations is going to help me better allocate those resources, better produce actionable information. So once again, these are screenshots from our own monitoring tool, but this is the point where now I can start using those more broad terms. Since everything that's coming back is mostly relevant to those communities and that conversation, now I can start using words like riot, words like protest, words like organize, because if this community is specifically using the word organize, that is probably something that I would hypothetically want to action on, not if anybody in the world is using a word like riot. And you can even see it there on the bottom right, this is still running and I'm still occasionally checking in from time to time. People are still very unhappy and they're still talking about locations on the ground they want to organize those protests. And as I said, nothing is perfect right out the gate. Most of this data was relevant, but because of the nature of those open source investigations and the massive amount of data that is being produced, you almost always get a little bit of noise. I started looking at my results and I said, you know what? For whatever reason, there's people talking about flooding, kind of in corollary to that food insecurity and those food prices. But I really didn't care if people were talking about floods. So go back and refine that filter and just exclude words like flood or flooding, or even just words like rainfall. And it just saves myself that extra work out the end. Because yes, could you manually search this data? 100%. But as you probably know, you have a limited amount of time to research. So if you can take those initial 5 or 10 minutes to set it up and continue to take that initial time to adapt your searches, you're going to save yourself so much time out the other side that 5 or 10 minutes is going to seem completely meaningless. Likewise, as I was looking through that data, I said, oh, that's kind of weird. They're using some hashtags that I don't recognize. I don't recognize them. Let's go ahead and throw them into my data feed and set them up to currently filter out. So, in summary for all of this, as I said, the most annoying thing about this, and I think the number one reason people have problems with this, is because it's so contrary to your initial instincts. Talking about that NA enumeration workflow, I've got an email address and I want to know as much about it as possible. In almost all cases, I just take that email address and start throwing it against every tool that I possibly have to get some more information. I generally don't have to do a whole lot of background research on that email address itself. But for monitoring, most likely, unless you are already intimately familiar with the community that you are looking into, you need to do that previous research. Consider that just a different way to hit the ground running. You're starting off with a kind of slow walk. That way you can sprint for a more extended period of time, rather than hitting the ground sprinting and soon finding yourself out of air, because again, all you're looking at is a whole bunch of noise, and that can get very dispiriting very, very quickly. Yeah, sorry, just reading off this. So, bottom line up front, number one, contrary to what you want to do, start small and focused. Start with those words that are just as relevant to the communities you're trying to follow as possible. What you're going to find is it is so much easier to start small and expand than start exceptionally broad and narrow it down. Just going back, you don't have to leave these data feeds exactly as they are. You start small so you can find those communities and find extra things to add into them, rather than starting amazingly broad and saying, all right, I need to filter out BTS, I need to filter out Donald Trump, I need to filter out the Beatles for some reason, I need to filter out Doom. Still getting a whole bunch of noise. All right, I also need to filter out references to Tom Jones. For some reason, he's showing up. Just a nightmare. You don't have time to do that. And then you create those filters for those results, because once again, as soon as you are tapped in those communities, you don't care about everything that you're saying, but there's some sort of that conversation in those communities that you want to listen in on. You're following those protests, you're doing that threat protection. You want to know the moment somebody uses one of those actual actionable terms. And you're doing threat protection and somebody says, hey, we're coming to kill you. I want to alert as soon as that happens. Not when somebody just says, we're coming to kill any random person that exists online. And this is a very iterative process. Again, one thing that I think a lot of people have difficulty with, I've taught OSINT for a while. I used to teach a 2-week-long course. When we go over monitoring, what I'd find out is the keywords that people had chose on day 1 of the class were the same keywords that they had on day 10 of the class. They didn't want to continue to update and find that new information. They said, no, I'm really smart. The words that I chose are the only words that I need to include on my monitor. They didn't have very good end results. You want to refine, adapt, and continually expand. And what you're going to find in the long run is, once again, even though you took this initial time to set this up, to do that research, the data that is going to come out in the other end is going to save you so much time. You're going to say, why haven't I not been doing this for every single monitoring workflow that I do? All right. I believe that leaves me with about 5 minutes. So does anybody have any questions?